well, we'll just make a start, an introduction as people filter in. So
Yes.
it's a particular pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Lionel Nashash, who's a professor of neurology, neurophysiology, and really a sort of heavyweight of the consciousness research field. And he has particularly good ideas and ways of thinking about some of the most complex topics which fascinate us all in neuropsychiatry. So not just consciousness, but also functional neurological disorders and hypnosis, and the interaction of these with the theory within consciousness research that he's most associated with, so this global neuronal workspace theory, which he'll talk us through today. We had a superb meeting that, for those of you listening, just as we were starting up, a meeting funded by the French Embassy in the UK last year, where we connected up the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience and King's sort of FND experts with those from the Salpêtrière and Sorbonne, where Lionel and colleagues work to really forge some connections between our two institutions. And one of the outcomes of this was Lionel coming to the UK and giving us a little bit of a teaser about this sort of area of interest and research to him, which we thought was so interesting we'd hopefully get a whole session on it. So it's fantastic that Lionel's going to be able to talk to us about this. Thank you so much for your time today, and I'm sure this will generate lots of interesting questions. So please put these in the chat as we go along. The three dots you can click on for captions, and obviously please don't interrupt the slides, take them over, and all the usual obvious things. So thanks for that, and there'll be time at the end to put your hand up as well as put questions in the chat as we go along. So thank you so much again, Lionel, for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you very much, Timothy, and I'm very glad to be here and as a continuation of these meetings that we had last year. So hi to everyone. So as Tim said, I'm both a neurologist and cognitive scientist. I'm working on consciousness. I'm not that an expert of FND or functional neurological disorders or hypnosis, but I try. Of course, I'm very interested in for years for many reasons that you can imagine. As soon as you are a neurologist and cognitive scientist, you cannot avoid or escape to these fascinating conditions. But I mean, I did not explore them very actively since the very last years and about hypnosis. So the three keywords today for me would be consciousness, FND for functional neurological disorders, and hypnosis. And we'll try to share with you some very speculative ideas. So I'm very happy that we could discuss about them, that you give me your feedback, and we can discuss about this possible mechanism, possible scenario of FND. So to do that, I will first I hope the slides are working. Yes, I will just go through a few premises and proposed scenario. So I will go back to very, very basic ideas that I think all of us share. So for instance, of course, when as clinicians, we deal with patients showing or affected by FND, of course, one of the key aspects is that the patients lacked what we could call symptoms adjunctivity. What I mean that is the patients are not simulating, they are not malingering. So they are affected with symptoms. They do not seem to be the conscious agent of these symptoms. I'm sorry, there is a sound to cut somewhere. I don't know who, but there is a mic open. Thank you very much. So the patients lack this kind of symptoms, adjunctivity, they do not easily control, at least for many of these FND patients. And still, when as neurologists or neuropsychiatrists or psychiatrists, we explore these patients, we first go back to this very old idea of lack of organicity, quotes. What do we really mean by lack of organicity? In a very crude or very basic terms, it means the patient doesn't have a brain tumor, doesn't have a multiple sclerosis, doesn't have any other neurological conditions that we can define, metabolic disease, etc., etc. But still, he is affected with these symptoms. He is not the conscious agent of. And still, if you really think about that, and for me, it's a very basic but very profound question. If you really still stick to a materialistic monism framework, what I mean is that you are not dualistic in any way, then you still have to explain how is it possible for this given patient to be affected with the symptoms he is not simulating. The symptoms you cannot put in relation straightforward with some organic dysfunction or disorganization of his brain structure of activity. And then the most common idea that I think explicitly or not most of us have when we deal with FND and with patients affected with FND is this very notion of conditions that could be related in a way to a top-down initiated process, a cognitive top-down initiated process that could induce a functional reorganization of a structurally normal brain. So, of course, for all of you, I guess, you know that behind these words, there is a long story of discussion. And for instance, you know, in at the Charcot era, Charcot time in Paris and everywhere, there was this notion of continuum between hysteria and epilepsy. So there was a condition called hysteria epilepsy, as suggesting this kind of trouble defining the conditions, the mechanisms, the scenario of these conditions. So what I would like to do today is try to take seriously this top-down initiated process to see how could we really try to translate it in some mechanism today in 2023 in the light of our current knowledge of the way cognitive top-down processes can occur in a mind, in a brain, in relation to conscious processing. And that's the second point. I would also try even to put forward a very speculative hypothesis, namely the fact that maybe some of these conditions could be initiated by a conscious top-down process. So in a way, a conscious voluntary top-down process, but inducing some involuntary and non-conscious lasting consequences that then are interpreted subjectively by the patient as being involuntary. So we go back to this notion, the patient in the end is not the conscious agent of the symptom, but maybe the story is a bit more complex by this kind of several stages in the scenario. I will come back to that, with maybe an initiation of the process that could be more conscious than we usually think it is. And of course, I will come back to several aspects of that, in particular also to the feeling that many clinicians have when they deal with patients with FND. There is this strange condition. Of course, they know the patient is not malingering, is not simulating, but still, it can induce some kind of reaction in the caregivers, in the clinician, in the psychologist, that could be interesting by themselves in the light of this scenario. So I'm sorry for this kind of long introduction, but as Tim said, for me, it was most a brainstorming meetings and let's say to communicate you only some results that we had in the lab during the last 20 or more years. So it means that we could have a first link between FND and hypnosis here, because of course, hypnosis can be defined as a model of such a functional reorganization of central nervous system activity that is initiated by a conscious top-down process. So during hypnotic induction, you could then induce through very often through the media of another people, but you could induce in the subject, not in the patient, let's say in the individual, you could induce a top-down conscious process that will then be followed by a lot of consequences that we can study in the lab or in the clinics. So at least we could see here a first reason to link the two phenomena, FND and hypnosis, by the fact that both could belong to this kind of conditions in which you would have a functional reorganization of CNS initiated by a conscious top-down process. And I will illustrate it in the second part of my talk by some recent works in the lab, in particular with Esteban Munoz-Musat, who was here last year with me, with the Paris team when we visited the London team last year. So of course, and I will be done with history in a way, we could, of course, reactivate a kind of old historical debate, you know. So I'm sorry, because this one was initially a French debate, but it's much more important than France. The Charcot-Bernheim debate, for those of you who are familiar with this slice of history of FND and hysteria, etc. So we could move from the Charcot-Bernheim debate toward the Charcot 2.0 perspective. So as you remember, Charcot in Paris had this very wrong hypothesis with the École de Salpêtrière that hypnosis could be a pathological state specific to hysterical patients. I will not develop this idea today. And then in reaction to this statement, Bernheim at Nancy, in the east of France, you know, he was very famous by this day, Bernheim. And so he proposed, in full opposition to Charcot and his school, that hypnosis was absolutely not a pathological state, but a physiological state, not specific to pathological conditions such as hysteria. And the debate was put forward this way. But then, in the light of what I'm proposing today, maybe we can, of course, Charcot was wrong. I think we can say that, but we could still find a way to relink the two conditions only by going back to this idea I introduced in the previous slide, namely that FND and hypnosis, so hysteria, FND, and hypnosis, both belong to this general class of functional reorganization of CNS initiated by a conscious top-down process. That would be the hypothesis I would like to tackle today with you. So, of course, if we do that, there is also a second link that we could establish between hypnosis and FND. And this time it's not a mechanistic or a model one of the other. So not only to think about hypnosis as a model of FND or some mechanisms involved in some FND conditions, but rather from the therapeutic aspects to say that you can cure some FND by the use of top-down initiated therapeutics. And as soon as you point to this general category of top-down initiated therapeutics, you can think about psychotherapy in general. Hypnosis here could be one candidate, CBT, of course, and you can also go to more, let's say, explicitly more biological aspect like global workspace drugs, so drugs that would specifically play an action on the top-down conscious processes. I will go back to that in 2 minutes. And of course, you can use also electroceuticals, so like TDCS, TACS, when you try to focus on some conscious processes. So that will be the main reason why at this stage of my talk, I have to move to consciousness. So to try to really explore what I mean here by this notion of functional reorganization of the CNS that could be initiated by a conscious top-down process. And to do that, I will try to make clear for everyone. I think it's already clear for many of you, but maybe it's not the case. We discussed with Tim before, just to introduce you, if it's not yet the case, to one current model of consciousness, a biological model of consciousness that we developed with Stanislas Dehaene, Jean-Pierre Changeux, Claire Sergent, and many other colleagues since 2001. And in continuation, in a way, of Bernard Baars, the American psychologist who framed this global workspace theory of consciousness and a pure cognitive psychology framework. And then we, Stan and Jean-Pierre, we try to propose a neuronal version of it. So I have a timer under my eyes. I will try to make this symbol fully clear and fully transparent to each of you in less than 10 minutes. So that's the teaser for you to stay awake. So, of course, when you deal with consciousness, you need a definition of consciousness. Of course, like for anything you want to work on, you have to define the object of your inquiry, of your science. So I will just use one slide. If you have questions, please keep them for the end. We can discuss. I will try to make it 45 minutes long. So we use this very general definition of consciousness that we can debate, namely saying that being conscious corresponds to be the subject of a subjective or first-person experience that you can self-report to yourself. So we could propose that being conscious is related to this notion of self-reportability. As soon as an individual is able to self-report to him or to herself a mental representation, we would label this individual as being conscious. So of course, we can use it very easily in the perceptual field. I see X, I'm listening to Y, etc. But of course, you can use this self-reportability definition of consciousness to probe any conscious content. So you can probe episodic memory, and that will be conscious memory. I remember why. You can probe and self-report feelings or emotions, feelings, actions, intentions, etc. So in a way, this self-reportability definition, you can use it very generally speaking to probe any conscious content. So that's one of the advantage of this self-reflexive definition of consciousness. I would say, to be very short, that today no one discusses that a self-reportable individual is conscious. The question is rather, does this definition capture all what we want to define as being conscious, or is there something beyond self-reportability that we would like to still label as conscious, even if it's not reported? And I will not develop this debate today. I can point you to some articles. There is, for instance, NetBlock in the US claiming for years that P consciousness would go beyond access consciousness, and we can discuss that. And I belong to the class of people who think that self-report are the only necessary condition for defining consciousness, that you can capture everything you want to call conscious by this definition, but of course it's a debate that we can have later on if you want, but I will not discuss it specifically today. And the other point I wanted to say is that do not confuse what we call report, which is an internal psychological process, with the behavior that you could use to communicate your report to someone else. So self-reportability, it's not the behavior that you use to communicate your internal report. So a locked-in syndrome patient, for instance, when he's awake, he's fully conscious according to this definition, even if he's not able to easily communicate his internal state, his internal self-report. So it's not a behavior. I will not develop the other point, just to say that as soon as you define consciousness this way, you can at least delineate two major questions. The question of physiology of conscious states. So what do you need in a brain for this brain to be in a conscious mode? So for the individual with this brain being able to self-report the first person experience, subjective experience. So the physiological conditions of conscious states. And then, of course, the second big question is if you consider a conscious individual, so someone who is able to self-report mental representations, there is this question of access consciousness, access to consciousness, meaning what are the mechanisms which are sufficient and necessary for a given representation to access your conscious content rather than another mental representation. So what are the mechanisms of conscious access? And of course, the two are not the same question. So a comatose patient is, let's say, impairment of conscious state. A neglect patient with difficulties to access left side representation is related to conscious access impairment, we could say, in a patient who is, when he's awake, completely conscious in a way, in the conscious state perspective. So we will try to present this model, trying to explain these two questions of consciousness. And to do that, I just have to say that the global workspace, as I said, was introduced by Bernard Bass. And for me, even the GNW, the global neuronal workspace, it's a psychologically driven theory. So I will just go back to two main ideas of the model. If you take seriously this self-report definition of consciousness, and you go to cognitive psychology in healthy individuals, using a lot of paradigms, subliminal perception, attentional blink, inattentional blindness, or whatever, and also in patients, in many patients, then you can discover the following thing, that as soon as you can self-report something, so as soon as you're conscious of something, you have some other cognitive properties that seem to be, in a way, specifically linked to this conscious mode of processing. So some of them are here: explicit maintenance of information, cognitive flexibility, etc., transfer to long-term memory, blah, blah. But I will focus on one key property today, cognitive availability. So what we mean by cognitive availability is that as soon as you are conscious of something, in a way, you can use this something with all your cognitive abilities. When you perceive a word, for instance, when you are conscious of it, not only can you process its semantic stage of representation, and by the way, we could demonstrate that subliminal words can be represented at the semantic stage without you being aware of the word. So semantic representation does not seem to be a specific property of conscious processing, but still, when you are conscious of this word, you can decide to recall a specific episodic memory related to this word. You can decide to translate this word into another language. You can decide to count the numerical value of its letters, to sum them. You can do whatever you want in a way. And here I go back to this fundamental idea of modularity versus non-modularity of cognitive processing. And in a lot of studies, a lot of perspective, you have this notion that when you are conscious of something, in a way you break the modularity, the psychological modularity of processing, which seems to be very specific to non-conscious processing. So that's a very important idea that is at the core of this global workspace model. And with Stanislas, Jean-Pierre, and the colleagues, which just try to to put forward a kind of axiomatic single axiom saying that to this cognitive availability, there should be a neural equivalence. So we should find exactly the equivalence in neural terms to this cognitive availability, to this break of modularity. So to give you just a very short illustration of it, and by the way, if you go back to the seminal book of Fodor, Jerry Fodor in '83, Modularity of Mind is exactly to describe mind as a set of modules, of cognitive modules, with all the traditional properties of non-conscious processing. And the second part of the book, Fodor himself states that when you are in the conscious mode, you break this modularity. So it's not a new idea. You find it under a lot of descriptive terms in many authors, many theorists. So, for instance, I will just give you one illustration. So you have this modularity for unconscious cognition. You break the modularity for conscious cognition, and then we just propose exactly the same, a neural modularity for unconscious cognitive processes, and a break of this modularity process information consciously, but in brain activity. So just, I think I prepared 2 slides. So on this slide, the first stage of description of this slide. So it was inspired by Marcel Mesulam's paper in Brain 98 from sensation to perception, if I'm correct. And then Jean-Pierre and Stan took this, were inspired by this figure. So what you see here on the concentric circles, it's to represent simply the hierarchy of cortical networks in the brain. So with a more outer, more external circle corresponding to regions, to cortical regions, which are in a way in direct contact with the external world. So all the primary cortical areas, primary sensory, motor, auditory, visual, etc. And then when you are in the second circle, you are already, let's say, in the secondary level of hierarchy of cortical regions. And the more you go inside, the more you go to associative, multimodal, associative, heteroassociative cortices. So in a way, you describe here the cortex as 2 spaces. And that's the first idea of the model. So you would have a first space, let's say the peripheral space, which is basically defined by a collection, a multitude of chains of neural processors, which are coding information in parallel, one with the other. Imagine here it's a phase perception network from V1 to FFA, phase fusiform area, to a more anterior aspect of the ventral pathway, dorsal route of phase processing. So you could have some specialized network, but basically at any time, all of these networks can work in parallel, the one with the other. And the key idea is that what is in this peripheral space would correspond to the modularity of brain processing, of cognitive processing, and would not correspond to a conscious experience. So you are not aware. One key aspect of the model is that you are not aware, you cannot self-report all what is happening in this peripheral space. But then at the center, at the core center of this space, you have this set of regions, which are the more, let's say, in this hierarchy, heteromodal associative cortices, mostly in prefrontal and parietal, but also there is some of these neurons everywhere in all the other lobes. But this high-level cognitive network, we call it the global workspace. And actually, we call it the global workspace. And the key idea is that these regions define another stage of processing, this global workspace. And this global workspace, basically, the content of it would correspond to what you experience consciously at a given moment. So if you have a functional workspace, you are conscious, and the representation which would be coded inside would correspond to your conscious content. And I will just develop that for 2 ideas. Of course, for the cognitive availability, you can see easily that when you can put the 2 spaces together, the peripheral space would respect and would be explained by the modularity of cognitive processing. So automatic, fast, unconscious, irrepressible, specialized, etc., all the attributes of automaticity and modularity. But as soon as something is here in the central space, then it can circulate across all these processors of high-level cognition, which are all of them in relation with the peripheral space. So this inner high-level space in which the representation would be broadcasted would explain, according to this model, why when you are a representation inside this workspace, explicitly coded inside this global workspace, not only would you be able to self-report it, but it can circulate and you can use it to manipulate this representation with all the cognitive abilities that you have. And that would be the neural equivalent to this cognitive availability property of conscious processing. And to go faster for the second property, so I can show you with, like a long time ago, we could publish in Nature Neuroscience with Stan that when you present subject with subliminal words without conscious processing, the subject is not able to self-report the presence of the word. Still, we could demonstrate for the first time that you can have high-level cognitive processing activation, processing of these words, but a modular way, in particular here in the visual word form area. But then when you move to conscious cognition, so you unmask the word is now consciously visible, and you can self-report it. Not only the perceptual region in the peripheral space is activated, but you have a co-activation of the frontoparietal network, which would here correspond to the epicenters of this global workspace. So you see, and we can go even forward in this model. And during the PhD of Raphaël Gaillard and then with Iman El-Karoui, we were able to dissect the dynamics of neural activation and to show that actually, so it's a time frequency graph. You have the time according to the word presentation here on the x-axis on the abscissa, and then you have the frequency decomposition, Fourier-lag frequency decomposition of the EEG, intracranial EEG in epileptic patients with implanted electrodes. And basically what you have to see here, you see in color the functional connectivity between pairs of electrodes. So you can see that when the words are subliminal, they are activated, they are processed in many cortical, perceptual areas, a non-conscious way, but there is no increase of connectivity, broadcasting of the stimulation to, let's say, a whole brain network, to a brain scale network, such as a workspace. But we could discover that for the visible words, when you perceive the word, during the first 200 milliseconds, there is this unconscious stage of processing, but around 300 to 400, you have a massive sudden increase of broadcasting, so a communication, functional connectivity between perceptual areas and this frontoparietal network. And we could even go in more detail into the scenario of conscious access, and to make it provide you with an illustration from Marinkovic lab. You have this paper. You will see here what happens when you read a word consciously in healthy subjects. So it was a MEG study, magnetoencephalographic study. It's a left hemisphere profile view. And you can see the time here. I hope you will see. Sorry, I can show you again. Up. Yes, so of course you have the time in blue. And what you see basically, it's already over, so I will run it several times. Of course, reading begins in V1, around 770 milliseconds. And then you had what Victor Lame calls a feed-forward sweep from posterior to anterior regions, almost a ballistic chain of processing, which is not necessarily conscious actually, which is in this peripheral space. But if you pay attention to the posterior part of the cortex, so here, for instance, the relation to the visual world form area in the left fusiform gyrus, you will see that there is a late reactivation now. So you have a feed-forward sweep, then a reactivation. And basically what we could try to show is that actually the first stage of processing corresponds to this representation, a ballistic way in the workspace. But when you have this late reactivation, co-activated with the frontoparietal network, it seems to be the signature of this conscious access of the perceptual representation to this broadcast, to this global workspace stage of processing, which enable conscious access. Sorry. So I will try to be short now. It was just to put the main ideas of the workspace, and I will just end this first part with the following second properties of the global workspace. Sorry, which is a very basic but very deep, I think, and profound properties of conscious processing. You have this notion, of course, you know, the bistable visual representation, for instance, such as this rabbit, duck, Jastro figures that all of you are familiar with, but we have plenty of such stimuli. And what it is really interesting is that at one given time, we only have one thought of the same thing. So you cannot perceive both the rabbit and the duck at the same time, but you alternate between discrete perception, either the rabbit, either the duck. Of course, you know that both can be perceived, but at a given conscious moment, you only perceive one of these. And actually, when you go deep in the literature, and it's not because I'm French, but in this Descartes quote from Les Passions de l'âme, you have this sentence, nous n'avons qu'une seule et simple pensée d'une même chose en même temps. I can develop on that if you want, but basically, for us, that's the second major property, which is captured by our workspace model. So the global workspace not only is located at this high-level cognitive processing stage, but also this, let's say, frontoparietal global workspace is massively intraconnected. And the very dense, very rich intraconnection would explain the following consequences. Whereas in the periphery, you can have multiple unconscious representations coded explicitly in parallel, the one with the other. At a given moment, only one representation would dominate the workspace because of the intraconnectivity. There is no place for two mental objects. Only one is imposing its identities to the whole workspace. So it would explain why, when you are in the periphery, then you engage your attention, you have the second stage of processing, access to the workspace, and then you perceive one object. Of course, the object can be complex, but only one. So here for the key ideas, and I will just mention that we can today, with brain measures like EEG or fMRI or whatever, you can try to identify the matrix of the global workspace activity. So for instance, to give you just two illustrations, we can compute, and we could do that with Jean-Rémy King, Jacob Ossip, and colleagues. We could use some matrix of functional connectivity to show that you have here with EEG high density, all the hair and color correspond to connectivity between two electrodes in a high density scalp EEG. In conscious awake subjects, you have a high level of connectivity. But when you move to patients with impaired state of consciousness, and I will go here, for instance, in the vegetative state patients, you don't lose brain activity, but you lose this long distance brain scale cortical connectivity that is required, that is mandatory for a workspace to be functional. So in the vegetative state, for instance, the patients lack this key condition of workspace activity. And the second great idea is that you also have this global workspace activity to be complex. So in terms of information theory, quantification of complexity. So we can use several algorithms of complexity to show again that when you are conscious, your workspace is processing complex representation. When you go to VS patients, they lack the connectivity and the complexity. And to provide you a last illustration of the impairments of conscious states, a long time ago, I made the prediction that in patients with epilepsy, with focal epilepsy, we should be able to see that when the seizure is not accompanied with consciousness impairment, so what we used to call before the simple focal seizures, you should not have a propagation of the seizure within the workspace. But as soon as the patient would lose consciousness due to a focal simple seizure extending then in the second stage, the prediction would be that the patient is losing consciousness at the moment the seizure, initially focal, would propagate to the workspace. And basically, with our colleagues from Marseille, Fabrice Bartholomé's team, in a set of papers, we could demonstrate that, for instance, with temporal seizure, that the patient is losing consciousness when the seizure reaches the workspace. So it means, if you follow me, that for your workspace to work, it has to be connected, but it has to be complex. And when it is functionally too much connected, you lose consciousness because it's not complex sufficiently, like in epilepsy. And that's exactly what we just published this year, that with the same data set from a lot of patients, that the patient, when they lose consciousness, the seizure propagates to the workspace, and the global workspace complexity is reduced massively, as if all the neurons were doing the same thing. So there is no differentiation of the mental content. And that's a very important thing, because so it means that, for instance, in VS patients, it's not enough connected, so it's not also complex. But in the epileptic patients, you would have too much functionally connected during the seizure with this loss of complexity. So it was to provide you with a scenario of this workspace to stimulate the discussion that we can have. So now I move to the second part. I will be shorter, but it was really mandatory for you to see what could be the added value of the discussion. So the key idea we introduced in this model is that here you would have a workspace unit here in blue, and our works, theoretical and empirical, show that actually what happens in the periphery is absolutely not immune to global workspace influence. So against a long tradition in cognitive psychology, we could provide the idea and provide some findings showing that actually, according to your conscious posture, so the activity, the setting of your workspace, you would have some influences, and sometimes some very major influences on unconscious cognition. So of course, in a, let's say in psychoanalytic, Freudian or post-Freudian perspective, we are very interested by exploring how non-conscious processing can influence conscious processing, which is obvious, even if we can completely disagree on the theory of what is called unconscious there. But what is really important also to consider is the reverse, that your conscious setting is massively influencing many parts of the unconscious cognitive processing, and then you will have the link with hypnosis and with FND, and in particular in the high-level stages of unconscious processing. So in a way, it's a revision of the traditional automaticity. You remember when you go back to automaticity, one of the key properties that it's not under executive control, it's uncontrollable, irrepressible, etc. But actually, you can have unconscious processing, which is operating under conscious influence. And I think that could be the big avenue for rereading what is happening in hypnosis and in FND. So I will skip this part because it's not interesting, just to show you that was one of the first demonstrations we made to show that even subliminal priming, so you are influenced by the semantic content of a word or a number, we were able to show that actually you have this unconscious cognitive processing being active only when you are in a specific conscious posture. If we, for instance, in this work, we played on temporal attention. If I distract you on temporal attention to when in time have you to pay attention, we could show that you do not have any subliminal priming effects anymore. So when you focus your attention at a moment, of course, you increase the conscious processing of what you are conscious of, but you also, unbeknownst to you, influence and increase unconscious processing in this temporal window. So it's just an illustration of unconscious process, which is massively influenced, unbeknownst to you, by your conscious posture at the moment you are perceiving or acting or thinking, more generally speaking. And this very general idea has been then developed in many, many aspects. So you have a lot of conscious influences and consequences on your unconscious cognitive processing. So then it was a long story to go to what is really linking us today with neuropsychiatry. One illustration for me of that are the very nice works of Anderson and his colleagues, you remember. So Anderson set up a very nice think-nothing paradigm, I think you are familiar with. So for instance, if you would run this experiment, you begin to learn association between not massively associated words, so steam train, okay, Joe, gum, or the roach, sorry for the accent. So you study, you build, you increase the semantic links. And then in the critical phase, you have two conditions, that a lot of control conditions too. Either you ask, so the subject is presented with one word of the pairs, and you ask him to think about the associated word, or you ask him not to think about the associated word. And you do that several times, etc. And the critical first finding in Nature was that when you then try to ask the subject to remember the initially trained pairs of words, you have this very nice result, which has been reproduced. And in our lab with Raphael Gaillard, Salvador, we reproduced and extended this work. Basically, you have the baseline here. When you overtrain, you can increase the association, but the critical finding is that when you were in the nothing phase, even if after you try to remember what you learned initially, you cannot really remember. So the active conscious posture of forgetting or putting a distance away from your cognitive association can be working. And when you go into the brain, the science paper Anderson and his colleagues could show that when you scan the subject during the think nothing phase, when you are in the nothing phase, you have a decrease of activity in hippocampal region for the nothing items, and you have a co-activation of this frontoparietal network. So you have a global workspace in a posture of forgetting. And the fact is that it's working because then you forget. So of course, it's not related at all to Freudian repression, because Freudian repression is unconscious forgetting. This is conscious forgetting, but then it obeys to the principle I showed you before. When you are in a conscious posture, not only can you do things, but you can do things which will have lasting consequences on your cognition, behavior, feelings, etc. So in a way, what I propose is that some FNDs will be done in 5 minutes, I think, 6-7 minutes. Some FNDs may stem from a consciously initiated process that we, in the clinics, it could be a fear, it could be a problem, it could be many things that we can discuss. And then this initial conscious posture would have some consequences on unconscious cognition and some unconscious and involuntary consequences that then translate into behavioral or cognitive symptoms, a palsy, involuntary movement, or a memory impairment, or whatever. But then the patient can just have access to the symptom, but losing the chain of processing that induce initially the symptoms, and he cannot introspect the initial setting of the symptomatology. And I propose in a book that is not translated, Le Nouvel Inconscient, I propose to call that, so I don't know if my translation is very good, a conscious south laundering, so like money laundering. So you can try to make money laundering like it would be a conscious south laundering scenario of FND, blanchiment sous les topiques, I call it in French, to play with Freud. So meaning that you will have a much more complex interplay between conscious and unconscious than we usually think. And in a way, I think it could be something like that. So you leave something, and you have some unusual initial conditions, massive emotional trauma, and all of us have met patients with such conditions. The patient is experiencing a very unusual emotional symptoms. And this conscious posture led him to induce some non-conscious influence on this conscious, this lasting conscious thought. For instance, it's the motor network with inhibition of motor regions, or in the field of memory. As a cognitive neurologist, I saw 3 patients in the last 2 years with such symptoms, like anterograde or retrograde amnesia induced by such a condition, without any organic findings that could explain easily the symptoms. And then the patient is just able to have access and to introspect the consequence of this initial circle of causality. And so he's not malingering, he's not simulating at all. And as long as there is not something able to break this vicious circle, it will be reinstantiated. So the patient will stay in this condition, except if you find a therapeutic effect, in which by several means you could reset the conscious posture and then play a role on the symptomatology. And in a way, something I would like to share with you. I opened my talk with that. One of the opening remarks I made is that clinically, I think personally, but I don't think I'm the single one. You know, the patient is not malingering, the patient is not simulating, blah, blah, that we know for sure. But you have this kind of, very often, this kind of uncanny introspective feeling with this unusual mixture of conscious, voluntary, involuntary, unconscious processes in the patient. And not only because you do not understand what happened. And I think that this kind of mixed feeling of course, the patient is not malingering, but there is something in the behavior, in the symptom, in cognitive symptom presentation that irrepressibly led me think about this conscious, unconscious, etc. So maybe this kind of scenario could explain this kind of very strange feelings that could be in a part diagnostic of diagnostic value sometimes, not a perfect one, that many clinicians feel when they are confronted to FND patients. So I would just end with a scenario, illustration of this scenario through hypnosis. You remember I told you, I don't know if of course, Charcot was wrong for the link between pathology, hypnosis, but if we take this hypnosis as a model of conscious posture inducing a functional reorganization of your CNS, and then you could use hypnosis as a model, at least a partial model of some FND. So with Esteban Munoz Musat, who is a neurologist finishing his PhD under my supervision, he's a very brilliant researcher. We made, and with Jean-Marc Beniem, we make this study. So we induced, I make it short, we induced deafness in an individual. So we induced deafness. So we had a complex procedure just to be sure that the induction of deafness to tones. So sometimes we are playing tones, and in order not for her to speak, we had a motor code to let her know if she could reach deafness or not. So it was a very long process. You can read the paper if you want, but here are the main results. So we recorded not only the subjective perception, the deafness, conscious deafness, but also high density EEG in this individual. And basically what we could find is that when you pay a look to EAPs, event-related potentials in EEG and other stimulus lock measures, we could first confirm that early cortical processing was normal. So the P1, auditory P1, was absolutely not affected by this hypnotic deafness. So even when the patient was, the subject, sorry, the individual was not aware of the tones, still the tones were processed exactly the same way, as long as you can see, you can say with EEG, you could not find any difference in this early focal area in the peripheral space, the modular auditory module in a way. But then at the end of the process, we could see here on the top, you have the proposed neural signature of conscious access. When you can report to yourself something, you have this P3B EAP around 300 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. And so when the individual, was before the hypnotic induction, she had a perfectly normal P3B. She was aware of the tones. But when she reported to us through the motor code that she could reach deafness, she lost the P3. So we could not find any more P3B. But still, we could find and discover, and that was a work of Esteban, to discover here. So between the preservation of early processing and the full vanishing of late global workspace access processing, we could find in the hypnotic condition this anterior positivity. And this anterior positivity was most probably originating from anterior cingulate cortex. So, and it was absent during the pre-hypnotic or post-hypnotic conditions. So suggesting that, in a way, if you take, again, the scenario, the subject tries to induce a state consciously, I want to be deaf, etc., to reach deafness. At one point, she could reach it. And the way she did was to activate a part of the workspace, the anterior cingulate, to inhibit the access of the early auditory processing to the global workspace. That would be a basic scenario according to this general principle and to the functional architecture of your brain in this GNW theory. And we could go further to this using decoding techniques. So I will skip that, but this decoding and time generalization decoding just confirmed and made some more subtleties about what I just told you. And I will just end up with this finding. We could measure functional connectivity, remember, in the light of the workspace theory. And basically, we could see that during hypnosis, as compared to non-hypnotic state, we had first a decrease of connectivity within the alpha-beta band. And interestingly, this band is the one I showed you before for conscious access. So as if what we could see here was a consequence of this anterior cingulate activation with the inhibition of it, translating in a loss of connectivity between the perceptual auditory module and the global workspace. And at the same time, we had an increase of connectivity in the slow frequencies in the delta band. And with Pierre Bourdillon, a neurosurgeon with intracranial patients, we could discover, actually, I will make it very fast, that this WSMI measure of connectivity within this delta band is a very good measure of global workspace maintenance. So as if the subject to reach this inhibitory stage, making her deaf, went through a modification of the global workspace maintenance in the specific bands that are tapping into a global workspace maintenance. And so I think I will make it, I will stop basically for us to discuss. I hope I was not too long, that I was clear enough for you to take some ideas, and maybe we can discuss if we have some time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lionel. A fascinating and complex tour of and I think connection of very interesting areas of relevance to clinical neuroscience with FND, and of course, just the general working of the brain. So superb. So we've got a few hands up. Firstly, I can see Laith has a question. I don't know if you could turn your camera on and ask your question. Otherwise, then I'll start looking through the list of people with their hands up.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the really great talk. I was just wondering how the concept of a global workspace relates to working memory and sort of Baddeley and Hitch's episodic buffer. Are they the same things or are they different? Yeah, I'm just trying to get my head around that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. And the question is a fundamental question. So initially, we stated, and I still think that, of course, working memory has a lot of very proximity links with global workspace activity. So in a way, you could say working memory is your conscious content. In a way, you could say that. And that's what we wrote initially in the Cognition 2001 paper with Stan. And then, for instance, Stan, with some colleagues of him, tried to explore some non-conscious modalities of working memory in some implicit forms of working memories that can be reactivated. So it's an open question of science. But I would say that at least if you delineate in working memory all what we know through also electrophysiology, the active maintenance of a given representation, that would tap into your workspace, according to me. Yes. So but that go into the details, then you have to. So, for instance, there is something. Your question is very important because, I told you this definition that we use about reportability, and something very important that I skipped because first for sake of time, and also because no one really had the answer. What is the difference between reported and reportable? So, is the fact that you can report a way to probe that you were conscious of, or is it because it is being conscious, being reporting? And this distinction is not the same. And so, for instance, for working memory, 7 items content, of course, you do not self-report each of them at any moment, but they are here. So we try to develop the notion of meta-report, primary report, or for instance, Claire Sergent proposed, she has an expression for that in the last in her last Nature Neuroscience paper, global playground. So to tap into this discussion between reported versus reportable, and your question, I think, taps also into this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got quite a few hands up and some questions in the room, I think. But I think that it's great to have John Stone on, and just given that you might have to go to clinic, I don't know, but if you wanted to ask your question in case you do, and then I think there's others online and in person.
Thanks very much, Lionel. That was great.
Thank you.
I had a question about this idea you put forward about thought laundering. I mean, the example you gave was of someone who's very stressed. We know that can trigger FND, but more commonly, what patients describe is that they had a physical sensation like a migraine or an injury or something like that, which clearly would make everyone have a conscious thought of, I wonder why my arm feels funny, I wonder why it's sore. And so therefore you can see how a conscious thought triggers this automatic process. I suppose I just wanted to highlight that it's a slightly more mundane explanation. It's less exciting to think of, we've solved why stress causes paralysis. It's just thinking about your leg makes your leg go wrong. Is basically the loop that. And I just wondered if you could expand a bit on the types of these conscious self-reported thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's, of course, it's. I think it's also to go back to. I don't know if you share this very special feeling that very often you have as a clinician in front of a FND patient, which is for me when I try to introspect the state. It's exactly what I said, at least for me. But I think I'm not the only one because I discussed with a lot of clinicians. But the fact that you have a mixture yourself when you introspect your reaction into the behavior and the condition of the patient, as this kind of self-contradictory mixture of something related to a voluntary process of the patient, and at the same time something which is absolutely not voluntary. So I think that's the reason why I try to explore also. Could you explain some facets of this apparently contradictory attributes, but you can solve this contradiction, this apparent contradiction, by referring this voluntary and involuntary to different aspects of the chain of causality. But I agree with you. So I gave the illustration of strong emotional complaint, whereas, as you say, you can have a very basic physical symptoms, migraine, etc. So I don't have a general explanation of it, but I would just want, in the contrary, to have your reaction about that. So do you think this kind of model could play a role in the very common day FND patients that you can see?
I think it does, but I would actually disagree about that sort of uncanny feeling of voluntariness. I would say, well, if there's a disorder of higher volition that we're proposing, wouldn't that always give the clinician that uncanny feeling? Because if you're looking at something that I think that's a problem to do with the clinicians unsure what they're dealing with, rather than an insight into physiology. That's my that's my feeling about it, and I'm not sure that helps us.
No, I would love to discuss with you, or we could discuss another time, really about, for instance, you know, when you use, of course, the traditional attentional distraction to see if you would have an impact on involuntary movement in a FND patient. For sure, when you do that, you would not claim that because you modulate the attention, you modulate the malingering of the patient. In any situation, the patient is not malingering. But the fact that when you tap into a conscious ability related to the endogenous attention, you have a modification of the symptom, then you are, in what I'm trying to say, that you have an interplay between the conscious posture of the patient and the symptoms, but without the patient being malingering. But still, because you have this mixture of, and why, you know, when I'm sure I don't know, but maybe you would agree. But when you try to instruct this kind of clinical tricks to young MDs, neurologists, or psychiatrists, you have to deal a lot of attention to explain them that the patient are not malingering. It's not because I will play something which is usually related to your voluntary attention that the symptom is a simulation of malingering. So I think this contradiction is everywhere. Of course, when you are a trained clinician, you can maybe get rid of it. But still, I think it's something very interesting, even in the history of these symptoms and this condition. But I would love to go on this discussion. Yes.
Sure.
Fascinating stuff. So I think Nick's got to go to clinic soon as well, or assessment. So if Nick could ask a question, then we'll go into the room, and then I know Mike's got a question as well, and we'll keep going until Lionel. I don't know how you are for time, but I'm okay. I'm okay. More about
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Lionel, for an absolutely brilliant talk. It's a similar sort of point to the one that John was making. You know, I also see lots of patients with FND. I've come across a few patients where eventually what's come out is a story that actually this started as a conscious simulation. It started as, you know, something that was clearly factitious or malingering, but then after a while, it seemed to get stuck. And I think that would actually fit with your model very well, that kind of scenario. And I think that's an example where we could agree that the model absolutely describes what's happening. So very interesting from that point of view. The degree to which it's, obviously those cases are pretty unusual, the degree to which it's applicable to, you know, FND in a more general sense. I guess I would share some of John's misgivings about that, but I certainly know what you mean by this kind of uncanny valley feeling about, you know, we're taught that malingering or factitious is conscious and FND is unconscious, and it's this very black or white thing, whereas a lot of the patients one encounters, one has a sense of some strange grey area. But I mean, I suppose it seems like what you're saying in very kind of banal layman's terms could be seen as they've thought themselves into it.
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to check. Is that
yes,
you know, is that the kind of lay summary of what you're saying, that people have somehow thought themselves into it? Yeah.
Yes. The only thing I would add is that because of our knowledge about cognitive psychology of this interaction between conscious and unconscious processing, then you can enlighten this basic way of phrasing it by having in mind the fact that, contrarily to what has been told for decades in psychology, unconscious processing is not automatic in the traditional term. So you can have a lot of influences on it. And the fact that you can begin to describe that, I think makes this very old and very basic state of what I said more clear, because we can have some scenario about it, not only to say that this way, because many times when people say that, it's like, I don't speak of ethics or moral, but like an engagement of the agentivity of the patient. Is or she is responsible for the symptom, which is absolutely not what I'm saying. But I'm trying to explain how you can have this, exactly what you said at the beginning, this very strange mixture of attributes. Yes.
My sort of follow-up point or question, I suppose, was going to be, we know that patients with FND are prone to other forms of dissociation, like depersonalization, or they may develop functional memory problems and so on. And there's an argument that all of FND can be conceptualized as dissociative. And I was just wondering, how do other kinds of dissociative state work in your model? I mean, if someone's got, for example, a psychogenic amnesia, how does that translate into these kind of workspace diagrams, in that they're still conscious and they're still able to report conscious experience, but there's an area of conscious experience that they're apparently unable to report?
Yes. So, basically, I would say that, and I had in mind when I told you the story, the scenario, I had among the 3 patients, one of them had a psychogenic amnesia of the last 25 years after falling into the stairs in a professional burnout or overwork experience, etc. And so he basically, as you know, a pure psychogenic amnesia. So in my scenario, the patient is experiencing a complex posture about what he's living now. So he's engaging in this, in a way, close to the Anderson stuff I showed. You try to inhibit memory, access to episodic memory of what is just happening. And then by doing that, you lose control in a way, and you go beyond what you initially wanted to do. And then you are stuck with this amnesia, which is overflowing your initial intention to say just something is bothering me, but in the end, the inhibitory mechanism would go much far away than was initially planned, and could be then reinstantiated as long as you have this initial problem. But I cannot be more specific. And then what we could do another time would be, but I'm sure you're doing, is to take 2 or 3 clinical cases and to discuss, and not to be too general. But the general logic would be the one I showed with this kind of circle, in which you would have an initial conscious symptom. So another way of putting it is that, would you go for an FND in a comatose patient, for instance? So could we define FND in patients who are not in a conscious mode when the symptoms appear? I'm not sure we would be able to. It's an open question, but for me, if I'm correct, it's not possible to have an FND in a comatose patient. I mean, a de novo FND, FND. But that's an open question. I don't know what's your take on it, but.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I have to go and see a patient. I mean, I suppose one final thought would be that this idea of people, as you said, thinking themselves into it, to put it in very crude terms, I guess if you are someone that has a tendency to dissociate, it becomes easier to do that. It becomes easier to sort of enter that almost alternate reality where you're disabled or something like that. But these are, this is getting controversial. Okay, thanks very much. I've got to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Great. Tom, I don't know if you want to ask some questions in the room, and then we can get back to Mike or Matt.
I'll have a quick one as well. That's all right.
Oh, you want to go first? No, okay, good. Oh, hi, Lionel. Really beautiful. I have to say that, at some points I struggled, but I hope that, managed to get, the gist of it. So, but it's a more generic, question about, consciousness. I mean, throughout the years, people have tried to localize, if there is a center of consciousness in the brain. And, and most recently, there was a paper in Neuron a couple of years ago, putting it in the central lateral thalamus. So I wonder, where your theory about, the global neuronal workspace, is it localizing, or is it essentially describing consciousness as an on-off state, obviously, with a range in between that can affect any part of the brain.
I thank you very much, because it provides me some time, additional time to go back. So to be very clear, there are two things. The first thing is that for this global neuronal workspace theory, of course, to be conscious, you need this, let's say, frontoparietal network to have a sufficient minimal mass. So it's an open question. What is the minimal size of a workspace that you need? So for instance, we know that patients with callosotomy, only one hemisphere, you can have evidence of conscious processing, self-reportable, not only in the left speaking hemisphere, but also in the right hemisphere if you use clever modes of probing reports. So one hemisphere is enough. Very recently, I had the opportunity, I didn't know that before. I didn't know this condition before, but once, because I'm also exploring unconscious, patients in awake but non-communicative patients. So to see, are they minimally conscious, vegetative state, or other thing. And a few years ago, I was called to see a patient at the Children's Hospital in Paris, Necker. And then I could see the patient, the child, and it was useful to see him. And then I discussed with my colleagues, and in particular, there was a neurosurgeon, and I discovered, most probably you know this intervention, but I was not aware of it. It's called hemispherotomy. So in hemispherotomy for children with very severe epileptic encephalopathy, with one hemisphere which is severely impaired and initiating a lot of epileptic seizures, what you can do is to make a callosotomy, so you disconnect the two hemispheres, but you also disconnect the impaired hemisphere from the thalamus. And so we could explore 3 children like that with Atena Domerzi and colleagues, with Bloblom, my colleague also. And we could see with fMRI, and we have now with Johan Caudron new results with EEG, not yet published, that this, so you have a cortico-cortical connectivity, long distance. But when you don't have the thalamus, it seems that it's working on a non-conscious mode. So you don't have a workspace here. So it seems that you need some thalamus. Of course, we know that from the ascending reticular pathway, you need the central thalamus to activate, but also the associative thalamus for cortical network. But so to go back to your question, primary cortices do not play a role in the workspace. So you still have, it's not that everywhere is conscious. So you have this, let's say, to make it crude, frontoparietal network with thalamic afferent and reverberating network. And so it's not the case that all areas are playing the same role. It's not true. It's a hierarchical model. And as I showed you for the conscious access, you have this core architecture of the workspace, but according to the content of the workspace, you will increase and broadcast different representations that may originate from different parts of the peripheral space. So in a way, you have a fuzzy frontier. You have the core structure plus a moving frontier according to what is broadcasted, what is amplified. But I can send you, thank you. I can send you some papers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lionel. I have a sort of slightly conceptual question about the global workspace theory, which is one that I was slightly familiar with, but don't know loads about. But in comparison to another theory of consciousness, which is a predictive processing model, which I've read a bit about recently, so that consciousness arises as the kind of the in-between parts of sort of sensory information and kind of top-down processing, making predictions about the body and the environment and kind of the future and things. I think that's quite an interesting model for helping to explain FND and also thinking about my own research of psychedelics, if you may remember from my previous presentation. So I'm just wondering, does this, can these theories be integrated, or are they directly competing with each other, or are there things that they can learn from each other?
Thank you for your question. So I'm not an expert of all the versions of the predictive coding theory, which was also a lot developed and put forward by Carl Friston in London, for instance, etc. What I can say, and we studied and we published some works with that, of course, there is a lot of place for integration of the two theories. But the very crucial aspect for this question for me is that you have a lot of predictive coding that can apply to unconscious processing. So I know there is a mic open somewhere, no? Or maybe it's me, you think? I don't know, but because I have some noise. But are you listening to noise? No. So maybe it's my ears. Okay. So yes, given that you have a lot of predictive coding that is working also unconsciously, I think that the key relation between the two theories is that what are the specific properties of predictive coding when it corresponds to conscious processing as compared to unconscious predictive coding. So for instance, in a PNAS paper with colleagues, we used a paradigm that we developed before, the local global with same chain of tone. So we have auditory regularities, and you to see if the subject is able to encode the regularity, you violate the regularity and you see what happened in his brain or her brain. And what we found is that you have a cascade of predictive coding architecture from primary auditory cortices, so secondary auditory cortices, blah, 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 up to the workspace. And so you have a chain of prediction error responses as predicted by predictive coding theory. And many of them apply to the first ballistic part of the non-conscious processing. And I discussed with Anil Seth recently at the Patrick Villemier's and colleagues meeting in this event. Of course, the intersection, it's not a massive frontal shock. Sometimes it is, and I know we have to deal with things. But here, I think the predictive coding concept is a very general concept. And then some facets of it has to be specified to make the difference between unconscious predictive coding and conscious predictive coding. And I would expect the latter to be more, to be really different. So maybe to enter in a more symbolic mode, a more discrete mathematical sense, but we can discuss that here, of course.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Just me left in the room now, so no questions here.
Mike Kaufman, I'm not sure if you're still there. If you can ask your question.
Yeah, I've also tried to explain psychological forms of amnesia by analogy with Mike Anderson's findings in Brain in 2017. But if we go to your definition of conscious experience, in terms of I see, I remember, I feel, there's a problem, isn't there? Because what studies of severe amnesia show, whether in neurology or in psychiatry, is that there can be a clear dissociation between the ability to form episodic memories or lasting episodic memories and the ability to have conscious experience, as in HM or Clive Wearing. So is there a problem there, or how do you reconcile those observations?
Thank you, Michael, for your question. It's a very important question. I don't think there is a problem, but just to specify the terms. And of course, so I don't know if you would agree with that. But for me, for instance, in the field of episodic memory, this notion. So sometimes it's a bit. I'm not sure I like the word very much, but what is called sometimes autonoetic memory. So the fact that it's not only that you can report a statement, but you have this first-person reinstantiation of what you lived. So for me, that's a self-report, autonoetic. So then I would enter into the distinction between some statements that you could acquire without having them accompanied with a subjective experience of what you experienced when you lived this precise moment in time. So I would make this distinction that you can have some things that you can have some acquisition, but without this autonoetic memory. But in both conditions, you could call that conscious, but with a different content. Some which would be access to general considerations, even related to yourself, without the feeling of having experienced them, versus a more subjective center. But in both terms, I would call that, for me, the definition is very basic, is as soon as you can self-report to yourself anything, a hallucination, a false memory, a real memory, etc., you would be labeled as being conscious. Then, what is the status of this content? You have to dig further. What are the attributes of this object which is currently into your workspace? And it can be, then you could find the different distinctions that we can have in memory, for instance, but it does not qualify or disqualify the general principles that what you self-report at the moment, at the present moment, is what you are conscious of, and then we can discuss what it is. I don't know if it does answer your question, but I think it could. But
Well, I hate the term autonoetic
Yes,
memory.
I saw. Yes, I think it's a
but,
bit too pedantic for. But we don't need to have. In French, we say pedantic, or yes, I don't know in English too. Yes.
Pretentious.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But you could argue that severely amnesic patients can't form autonoetic memories, and yet they clearly have something which is conscious experience. When you see Clive Wearing in films, that's what he's displaying.
Yes, but for me, it was also what I said at the beginning. I think you have some impairments of conscious states. So, for instance, comatose, epilepsy with impairment of consciousness, late stages of dementia, etc., are impairments of conscious states, irrespective of the content. And then you have impairments of conscious contents. In visual neglect, in memory, anterograde amnesia, for me, it's an impairment of some aspects of conscious access, but the patient, for sure, as soon as he's awake or she's awake, is conscious in a conscious state. So that's the reason why I made this opening distinction between, because sometimes people confuse and they say the patient is conscious. Okay, we speak of conscious states on the one hand and the specific conscious content on the other hand. And the two questions, of course, they are related, but they are not the same.
Thank you, anyhow.
Thank you very much.
Great. John, I don't know if you've got your hand up again. Very welcome to come back in.
Sorry, it was an old hand.
It was an old hand. Lovely. There were a couple of questions from Niels and from Safia. I don't know if you're still around and would like to ask those. But do unmute yourself and put your screen on if you'd like to ask the question. But we can keep going if there are other questions, because it's such an interesting and rich conversation.
On my screen, it's written only 5 minutes left. Is it correct or not?
Okay.
Yes.
I don't think it times out like Zoom, which is good.
Okay.
So but it's so fascinating what the discussion in the area here. We can if there's still people who've got questions. So Safia and Niels, I'm not sure if you're still around, but if not, you've got a few seconds to chip in. Otherwise, I'll just wrap up by saying thank you, Lionel, for such a brilliant talk. It's so interesting, and be great to see your future work in this area and others perhaps being inspired by it to test these theories and to work out this fascinating intersection. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, and send me the links for the next meeting, because I think it's a very fascinating also arena to discuss about also the patients and the theories. Yes.
And we're recording this, and we'll put it. It's definitely a talk I'll need to watch a few times to fully digest and understand. Right. So, and I'm sure the same for everybody. So it'd be brilliant to put it up on our soon-to-be launched website very soon. So thanks everybody, and thanks Lionel again. And
thank you very much.
Hopefully we'll come and visit you soon.
Yes, please. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you.